Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Literary Theory Demystified by Lawrence J. Clark. That's me. Well, I can demystify literary theory, but I can't demystify this PowerPoint, which doesn't want to go. All right, let's try that again. Hello everybody, and welcome to Literary Theory Demystified by Lawrence J. Clark, PhD. That's me. First of all, we're going to ask the question, what is literary theory anyway? Well, all literary theory could be considered a response to Plato, the famous Greek philosopher, who said in his book, The Republic, that anybody who is a poet should be kicked out of the country. Now, why would he say such a thing? And who was he talking about? Well, at the time, they didn't really have authors because they didn't have printed books as we know them, but they did have poets and they did have playwrights. So what poets and playwrights did was they made up stories. And when you make up a story, you're telling a lie because that didn't really happen. So he said the poets are liars, so we can't trust them, so they should all be kicked out. All right. Now, I have a thing or two to say about that. One of the things I have to say is that, and we're going to talk about types of theory in just a second, but one of the things I have to say about it is that Aristotle would say something different. He would say that the poets are actually good for society because they help people to have a moment of what is called catharsis. Catharsis, that's a really important term. And what that means is, even though the story is a lie, it can be good for people because they can experience some emotions or experience something without really having to experience it in real life. So for example, let's say someone had a lot of anxiety and wanted to just go and kill everybody that they worked with. All right, so they were really upset. Well, then they go and they see a play. Now remember, they didn't have movies back in Plato's day, so they go see a play instead. And in the play, there is a big scene where there's a battle. And the good guys are fighting against the bad guys, and then the good guys kill all the bad guys, and they win, and everybody stands up and applauds at the end, and everybody feels really good because the good guys won. Well, the person who had the feeling inside that they wanted to kill their boss and all their coworkers because they were mean to them and they were bad guys, and the employee feels like a good guy, well, they get the feeling and the emotions out of having that action done without actually having to do it themselves. So that's what we mean by a cathartic experience. All right. Now, other people might say, well, if you have violence in a play or in a movie or in a video game, then that's bad for society because that's actually encouraging violence. And then some people can't tell the difference between reality and fantasy. So here we have the age-old argument. Is it good for people to experience lies in stories or in a play or in a movie? Or is it better for them to experience it, or is it bad for them to experience it because it's encouraging it? So this argument about violence in video games, for example, that's in the news right now is nothing new. It's the same thing that the Greeks were arguing about 2,500 years ago. So there are 4 different types of literary theory according to M.H. Abrams, who wrote a book that I have on my bookshelf. It's called The Mirror and the Lamp, a real action-packed thriller about literary theory in the 20th century. If you ever want to have a good night's sleep, you can open that book and it'll help put you to sleep. But if you are really, really interested in literary theory, M.H. Abrams did a really great job of explaining it. So what he did was he broke literary theory down into 4 different parts, 4 different types. And he called them the mimetic, the pragmatic, the expressive, and the objective. And we're going to look at each one now. First of all, the mimetic, that is imitation, from the Greek word mimesis. And the mimetic theory says that the best poems, and when I say poems, I mean short stories, I mean novels, I mean plays, I mean any kind of literature, all right? So we're just using the word poem to represent all those. So the best poems capture reality, and the reality as we see it or know it, and they imitate it. So for example, sometimes we've seen photographs, a painting that looks like a photograph. And when we see a painting that looks like a photograph, sometimes we have to look really closely and see, is that a painting or is that a photograph? And then we say, oh, wow, that's a painting. Wow, that artist is really talented, right? We think that. Well, that's a one type of art that is really closely imitating reality. We know that other artists are talented as well. Impressionists are really talented. Cubists are really talented, but in different ways. They have a whole different view of reality than the rest of us see, but they're not trying to capture reality. Maybe they're trying to capture an emotion, okay, or a sense of beauty or something like that. So we have Aristotle thinking that art is good if it brings us closer to reality, and Plato thinking that poetry brings us further away from reality and it's a bunch of lies and we should just get rid of it. Now the mimetic theories are concerned with the essence of a poem. What does it mean? That's really all that matters, and we're going to talk more about that in a little bit. The pragmatic. This is concerned with the social function of a poem. Does it have a purpose? It doesn't matter what that purpose might be. It might be to teach, maybe teach a moral lesson or teach a religious principle or a philosophical or political point. Or it might be just to please the audience and entertain them, right? But it does have a purpose. So a pragmatic theorist would try to look at a poem and say, okay, does it fulfill either one of these functions? Does it teach or does it please or entertain? And its main impact, the main thing that we're looking at is the impact that it has on the reader. That's the important thing, the impact that it has on the reader. Whereas the mimetic we're looking at how well does it reflect or imitate reality. Okay. Now, the expressive we're looking at the relationship between the poem and the person who wrote it, the poet. And this whole idea is based on the Romantic notion that poetry is an expression of our inner selves, of our inner being. And then it's the writer or the poet's own thoughts and feelings, and the soul, the actual soul of the poet is there being bared on the paper. And it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really have a purpose. It doesn't have to be imitating reality. Its main reason for being is just that it is expressing the thoughts and feelings of the writer. So an example of this might be, let's say a freshman girl in college. And she's writing in her diary about her boyfriend that just broke up with her and broke her heart. Okay? She's going to write and write and write and write and get all her feelings down on the paper. Now, is she reflecting reality? Maybe, maybe not, but it's her reality, right? It's her feelings and thoughts. Is she reflecting, is she trying to teach something? Is she trying to please someone else or entertain someone else? Well, someone else might be entertained if they come by and read her diary, like her big brother or something might be entertained if he finds her diary and says, oh, you got your heart broken, right? But that's not the whole point. The point of her writing it is not to teach anyone, not to entertain anyone, not to imitate the world. but to just express her inner thoughts and feelings. All right. And then the final type of literature as literary criticism, as M.H. Abrams would say it, is the objective. And this is where we're looking at just the poem itself. We're not really looking at its imitation of the world. We're not looking at its function of teaching or pleasing or entertaining. We're not looking at its ability to express the inner thoughts and feelings of the author. What we're really looking at is just the poem itself in its own little world. So we're looking at the structure. We're looking at the meter. We're looking at the number of feet. We're looking at the rhyme structure. We're looking at the metaphors and the symbolism, that kind of stuff. So those are our 4 basic types. And now what we're going to do is we're going to look at some 20th century literary criticism, starting with formalism, which is related to the objective type of theory that M.H. Abrams was talking about. So we will then move on to several other types of criticism that have become very popular. There are even more types of criticism than this, and this is why literary theory seems so confusing to a lot of people, especially to college students, when you are first trying to understand what is literary theory, what is literary criticism. I just don't even get that. What does that mean? And how does it relate to me or my life or what I'm studying or anything like that? I went through my whole undergraduate career without even ever hearing the word literary theory. I was not an English major. I was a communications major, mostly journalism. And I took a few creative writing courses, but I was a communications major with a music minor. And the word literary theory never entered my poor little freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior brain. Now, it was not until I was almost 30 years old, I was studying for a master's degree in English, and they had a course called Literary Criticism. And I asked my professor, my advisor, I said, well, what is that course? He said, oh, you're going to learn how to analyze literature. I said, do I have to take that? He said, well, no, but since you're going to take a lot of literature classes and you're going to have to write a bunch of papers, it might be interesting for you to learn about different ways of analyzing it. And that's all literary theory is, really, just different ways of looking at literature so that you have more choices of how to analyze it. Because otherwise, you're stuck analyzing it the way you were taught by your 7th or 8th grade English teacher, which was probably your formalist type critique, which is the one we're going to start with. So the formalism stresses the importance of the form, the literary form, and then trying to figure out what the work means. Where it doesn't look at the biographical information of the author or the historical information, what was going on in the society at the time, or what historical influences there were on the author. It doesn't even matter who wrote it in order to find out what the work, quote, really means. So again, just like when we were talking about the objective criticism, we're looking at the organization and the structure. We're looking at the words themselves, different types of meanings of each word. We're looking at the meter and the feet, the structure of it. So this movement was started by a guy named I.A. Richards and a group of other people around him. But he's the one that wrote the book that pretty much started this movement. And he wrote a book in 1929, almost 100 years ago, called Practical Criticism. And what he did was he had this idea, instead of studying the lives of the authors, and instead of studying the history and the psychology and all that other stuff, why not just give a poem to a student and say, here, read this poem, tell me what it means. Let's talk about the poem, only about the poem. Let's read it very closely. Let's look at the rhyme structure. Let's look at the tone, the style, the number of syllables, the exact meanings of certain words, and let's try to figure out what it means without knowing anything about who wrote it. And I have actually tried this experiment in classes myself. It's kind of fun. I've done it with poems that I have written myself, and I didn't tell the students. I've done it with poems that some friends of mine had written, and they were in the process of getting a book published. And then I would have the students read the poem, give me some feedback on it, or write a paper about it, and then I would send all the papers without the students' names on them, but I would send the papers to the author of the poem. And so it was always very interesting and fascinating for the author to see what other people think about what he or she wrote. So the whole point, though, is you don't really need to know, according to this theory, you don't need to know anything about the author or society or what year it was written or anything. You can just read it and try to figure it out. Now, when this movement came over to America, we called it the New Critical Theory. And the famous new critics in America, there were a group of them, but two of them that were really famous were Cleance Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. Now, if your name was Cleance, you probably have no choice in life except to be an English professor. What other thing would you do in the world if your name was Cleance? Okay, sorry to his mother. All right. Anyway, Cleance Brooks and Robert Penn Warren. And they made some college textbooks, and those textbooks were used for years and years and years and years and years. The new critical movement was just dominated the most of the 20th century up until, say, the 70s, really, and then it still went on. Now, starting, though, in the early 60s, people started thinking about, aren't there some other ways we can look at this literature? We're kind of bored with this method. Now, we also had some societal changes going on in the 50s and 60s. We had the beatniks and the hippies and the sexual revolution and the drug culture and the rock and roll and all these different things that happened to come along and influence our society. So because of that, people were rebelling against what was seen as normal or the status quo, and people said, I don't want to grow up and be just like my mother, or I don't want to grow up and be like my dad and work in the same office building or the same factory for 40 years, get a gold watch and retire. And people said, I want to do something different. And so life was changing in America. So at the same time, people's attitudes towards life were changing, and their attitudes towards what they were reading were changing. So people came up with some different ideas. One of these ideas is called reader response criticism. And this is the idea that the reader actually helps to invent or create the story or poem as it's being read. So this is kind of the opposite of formalism, which says that the meaning lies within the text itself. Instead, a reader response critic would say that the reader interacting with the text is what really makes it have meaning. So, for example, you have a 22-year-old man reading a work of literature. You have a 17-year-old girl reading a work of literature. You have a 10-year-old boy reading it. You have a 60-year-old who is a grandparent who has lived through a lot of life. You have a business person. You have a nurse. You have a factory worker. All those people reading the same work, it's actually a different work every time it's being read. This is what a reader response critic would say, because each person comes to the reading with their own experience, with their own prejudices, with their own biases, with their own political views, religious views, ethnic background, ideas about life that they've had from anywhere and from other people that they have run into. So this actually, because all of these thoughts and experiences have influenced the reader so much, then it actually influences the reading of the work and therefore changes the work that's being read. I'm hoping that makes some kind of sense. I'm trying to just explain it in really, really easy to understand, because my whole point here is to demystify literary criticism. And so I'm trying to take very, very complicated, complex subjects invented by people with PhDs who have nothing else to do but sit around and think all these intellectual thoughts, and then explain them to normal people, okay, like us. So what happened was, when I tried to start learning about this stuff, there was nobody to come along and explain it to me the way I'm trying to explain it to you. And I thought, wow, this stuff is really complicated, and I just didn't get it, because it was just too complicated. And they tried to make more out of it than there was. And as people with PhDs do, especially PhDs with in English, they would write these articles and books with these big, long, convoluted sentences and compound sentences, and using polysyllabic phrases and words that were just, they were trying to show off their education, basically. And one of the things one of the best compliments I ever got was a book review that was on a website, where they read my book and then did a review of it. And the thing that they said is, he overcomes his education in order to write accessible prose. So, meaning that I don't write in big, long sentences and a lot of high vocabulary, even though I have a high vocabulary, elevated vocabulary compared to a lot of people. But I try to say things in a way that people will understand. So anyway, I hope that's working for you here. And I'm going to move on now and talk a little bit about recursive reading, because recursive reading is really important. This is the idea, oopsie daisy, let's try that again. Okay, this is the idea of reading something more than once. So if you've ever seen a movie, you have probably watched, if it's a favorite movie of yours, you've probably watched it more than once. Well, years ago, we didn't do that. We watched a movie at the theater when it came out, and then maybe 3 years later, it might be shown on TV on a Thursday night at 7 o'clock. But if you missed it then and sat through all the, or if you saw it, you had to sit through all the commercials too. But if you missed it then it might not be on for another 3 or 4 or 5 years again. So we didn't have DVDs and VHS tapes and all that. I mean, I was born before even beta tapes were, Betamax tapes. That was the big deal. And I remember, I think I was in either high school or college before the first time I saw a recording where you could actually watch a movie. I mean, except for in school, they had the film strips, and they had 35 millimeter movies that the school could buy. They were really expensive, though. But for home use, we didn't have movies that we could just sit there and watch over and over and over and over. So, like when by the time my kids came along, they would get movies on VHS tapes, and they would just watch them over and over and over. So Aladdin and Sleeping Beauty and The Little Mermaid and The Lion King and all those movies I've seen a gazillion times, because they could watch them over and over. Well, by watching them over and over, they got a different view. They interpreted the movies differently. So if you're watching a movie and you know what the next line or the next scene is going to be before it even happens, well, you're going to react to it differently than if you've never seen that and then you're shocked by it or surprised, right? So in reading, it's the same thing. Maybe you're reading a poem and it has a surprise ending, or you're reading a short story and It has a plot twist. Right? Well, the first time you read it, you're surprised. The second time you read it, you're not quite as surprised. The fifth or the seventh or the 10th time you read it, you know it's coming, and you have been able to look at the structure of how it was happened, and then you can still enjoy it, but you're appreciating it in a different way because you can actually see what techniques, foreshadowing or whatever, that the author used to help you to get to that point. So recursive reading is really important, especially for reader response theorists. Now, reception theory says that each new generation of people will read the literary work differently. And this is because different things have happened in the world. The different historical events have happened, and different theories have come along, but also life is just different. So, for example, when people first read Huckleberry Finn, the book Huckleberry Finn, when people first read it, it was written, they might have said, oh, well, that's kind of funny the way Huckleberry Finn talks. Yeah, he talks like some country hick and stuff. And they would just kind of laugh at the way he talks. Well, nowadays people read Huckleberry Finn and they can't get past the fact that he uses the N-word, because the N-word has been deleted or just about from our vocabulary. And for good reason. It's very offensive to some people. Okay? But people reading it today read that differently than they would back then. So because of that, that's what we call reception theory, that the reception of the work is different depending on what else has happened beforehand. Same thing with any mention of any ethnicity or maybe things are read differently now. If it was happening, something happened in New York City, every time I read something or watch a movie about New York City, I always look to see if the Twin Towers are mentioned, or if the Twin Towers are pictured in the film, or if they're mentioned in a book, because that's a marker in our society, right? That was, for us anyway, maybe 100 years ago it won't be that big of a deal, but for us, in my generation, that was a defining moment in our world when our world changed. At least in America, it changed significantly. Now, I mean, I used to be able to go to the airport and I would fly around the country, and if I was going to fly through Atlanta, I would just call my uncle and my aunt and uncle and say, hey, I'm flying through Atlanta. I want to come to the airport restaurant and just, meet me for an hour. I've got a layover. And they'd say, oh, yeah, and they'd drive down to the airport and they'd walk right in and talk to me. And you didn't go through security until right before you got on the plane, basically. And if they even had it. I mean, they had it in some of the bigger airports. I don't know if they had it on even some of the smaller airports. Well, nowadays you can't do that. I mean, you can't even get through security unless you have a ticket in your hand. So if I want to stop and go see my aunt and uncle in Atlanta, if I'm flying through, I have to go out the gates, go meet them outside somewhere, then I have to come back in through the gates again, and then I better not bring a doggy bag with me if it has any soup in it, because it's a liquid, and I'm not allowed to on the plane with liquid because it might be a liquid bomb or something, right? A friend of mine bought a whole case of salsa in New Mexico and was going to bring the salsa back to New York or New Jersey or somewhere for gifts. Well, the security people took all their salsa away. I mean, a whole case, really expensive, $10 a bottle, homemade salsa, because the salsa is quote-unquote a liquid and wasn't allowed on the plane because it might have explosives in it. So anyway, it would be different today. That's a real long tangent off on a whole different topic, but let's get back to literary criticism here. Okay. All right. Stanley Fish, you just need to know that name. Stanley Fish wrote a really interesting book, Is There a Text in This Class? Meaning, yes, there is a text in this class. Every literature class has a textbook, but is there one text? Is there one text? Is it the same text that all the students are reading? Well, You can say, yes, it's the same words printed on the page, but as soon as one student and then another student, and another student look at those words on the page, absorb that information, mix it up with all of their experiences and thoughts and biases and political or religious beliefs, whatever, that becomes a different text in each student's hands. So that was his point. But it was kind of funny that a guy named Fish said, is there a text in this class? I read an article one time, is there a fish in this class? Making fun of his ideas, even though I agree with them. I tend to agree with them. Anyway, sociological criticism is our next one. Sociological theorists think that a work of literature cannot be separated from the social context in which it was made. And they look at different ways that it might have been written if different sociological events might have taken place. Now, two branches of sociological criticism that are very well known now are Feminist Criticism and Marxist Criticism. And we're going to talk more about each one of those. So Feminist Criticism began around the late 60s or so, and there were two really important books in this area. Mary Ellman's Thinking About Women and Kate Millett's Sexual Politics. And basically, what feminist critics believe is that the world, culture, and literature is all dominated by men. And at that time, that was pretty much true. Because if you looked at a college textbook, and if you looked at all the stories and the poems that were in that book, almost all of them would have been written by men. You might have a couple of token women in there. You might have Emily Dickinson, for example, or Sylvia Plath, maybe a couple of women, but mostly all the work in there would have been written by men. Well, there are some women who were not real happy about that. And they also had some different ideas about what is male, what is female, and the idea that, well, are people actually born male or female, and how do you define that? Well, obviously, we know that people are born with different body parts, which makes them a male or a female. But culturally, how is it that a female acts and behaves in society as opposed to how a male acts and behaves? That, according to these theorists, is all culturally learned behavior rather than inborn. Now, being a father of 3 kids, 2 girls and a boy, I can say that from my experience, there are definite differences between the males and the females in their behavior, even without doing anything. So, for example, when my oldest daughter was born, we had this rule, no guns or knives, no toy guns or knives in the house. I didn't want any kind of violent behavior, violent toys. Well, then my son came along. And little boys, you don't have to teach them that guns exist. You can keep them away from the fact that guns exist. You don't have to let them have toy guns in the house. They will find a stick and turn it into a gun and start shooting other people, even if they've never seen a gun. They will find a stick and beat their sister over the head with it. So there are definitely some male aggressive type behaviors. But on the other hand, my daughter would beat the you-know-what out of my son just as much. So was that learned behavior? I don't know. So, we'd always tell her, oh, yes, you need to be more ladylike and all that, right? Well, so much for that. Yeah. Anyway, so feminist critics look at the paternalistic society, meaning the male-oriented society, and look at how some of those stereotypes that are from that type of a society appear in literature. The other thing that feminist critics have done is that they have added more female works to the literary canon. meaning the group, the literary canon is the group of works that are generally accepted as the great classics of literature. And because there are more feminist critics out there and more females in the profession of literary criticism, there are now more females included. So if you look at the Norton Anthology of Literature from the 1960s, and then look at how many females were in it, how few females were in it, now look at it, the one that's published last year, or whenever the latest edition was, you'll see a lot more females that are in there now. All right. So again, they have helped to redefine the literary canon. Another thing they've done is gone back and found writing by women that they consider to be good quality literature, but maybe it wasn't published because not as many women got published back, say, in the 1800s, for example. Doesn't mean that they weren't writing, it just meant that they weren't published. So some of those women have now been published 150 years after they died and rediscovered, and now you have master's and doctoral students writing their theses and dissertations about them. Okay, so let's move on now to Marxist criticism. Marxist criticism is not communist criticism, but it is based on the ideas of Marx and Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto, their ideas that the middle class would eventually be overthrown by the working class. And the reason why is because, according to them, the middle class, and they had a little different definition of middle class than we do now, but for them, the middle class was the merchant class, the people who were owned the stores and owned the factories. They were the middle class at that time, not the, as opposed to the royalty, all right, the aristocracy. So these people were considered to be corrupt and tainted, and they were always pushing down the workers and trying to exploit the workers. Now, what Marxist criticism does is looks at literature and tries to figure out the economic situations that are going on in the literature and how they affect the production and consumption of that literature, and also how those economic situations are portrayed within the work. Okay, New Historicism. New historicists look at the text and look at it in relation to its historical and cultural context of the time that it was created. So this is really, really important. One of the things that they will say is that history is not fact. And we all know that history is written by whom? Written by the victors, right? Written by the people who won the battle. If one country fights against another country, or if somebody takes over in politics, well, the people who are in charge get to decide what goes in the textbooks. And there are many, many, many examples. One is, obvious one is Stalinist Russia, where they killed off a bunch of the intellectuals and then created their own, and then rewrote the history to show that they were wonderful and that the people who came before them were horrible and evil. Now, there might be some truth in that. Obviously, the czars and the aristocracy in Russia did take advantage of the little people and lived like kings and queens because, well, they were kings and queens. But they lived high on the hog, as we would say, at the expense of the little people. But then along came the revolution, and then the people who got in power in the revolution, they started to live really well, and then the workers were still being exploited. So unfortunately, that's just the way things go. But the idea of New Historicism is that we can go back and look at history, and we can, if you've ever heard the term revisionist history, we can actually go back and revise history and rewrite it sometimes based on new information that we find out, because the history that we have is tainted. It's not really real because it was written by the people who were in power. So it wasn't necessarily fact, it was just their point of view. All right. Louis Althusser is very important in this field, and he talks about ideology and how ideology can get in the way of people's interpretation of fact and also of literature. So certain ideologies, if you have a certain ideology, let's say a capitalist ideology, where you think that it's good to work hard and that people should keep their own money and private property is good for society, for example, you will have a different view of certain scenes or certain characters than someone who believes in more of a socialist ideology, which says that people should work more for the common good, private property is not necessarily good for society, etc. So whatever your ideology is, it affects your writing of literature, and it also affects the way you read it and understand it. Michel Foucault is also a very important literary theorist, and he liked to look at the interaction of power and the different systems of power and how they change, and like their literary theories based on his views of society changing and the power structures that exist. Okay, Mikhail Bakhtin, he wrote The Dialogic Imagination. I did a lot of work studying him in my doctoral studies, and he talked about discourse, meaning conversations, okay, between people, and that there's this whole idea of dialogicity, where people are talking out their issues rather than fighting them out. Okay, so if you can get people to talk and reach some kind of consensus, then you come and you arrive at a created or agreed upon truth. So for example, in our country right now, we have discussed the issue of racism, for example, in our country. And we have decided as a society that racism is not to be tolerated and is not good. And we have pretty much agreed on that. There are a few holdouts. You have your white supremacist groups and your KKK groups and your neo-Nazi groups, but they're very, very small. Most of our society has come to an agreement, not by any kind of revolution or force or anything like that, but just by discussing the issue. And most people have agreed that it's not right to judge someone just because of the color of their skin or the country that they were born in or anything like that. So that's a good thing, according to Mikhail Bakhtin. And he will, anyway, okay, so that's Mikhail Bakhtin, dialogicity. All right, so new historical criticism is looking at literature in that it cannot exist outside the time and place in which it was written. So as opposed, remember, to the formalism we looked at, the objective criticism only looks at the poem or the story and the way that it, and its internal structure. And it doesn't matter about the history, where it was made, what was going on in real life at that time. Well, historical critics believe that the writer and the reader are both influenced by the culture and the history of what's going on when they're either writing it or reading it. Okay, feminist critics we talked about, and Marxist critics we talked about. All right, let's go on to psychoanalytical criticism. And we just have a couple more here, and then we'll be done. Psychoanalytical criticism is based on the works and the writings of the most famous psychiatrist in the world, Sigmund Freud. Now, some of his ideas are based on our subconscious, and what the things that are most important are not the things that we consciously think about, but that we subconsciously think about, or that we have been conditioned to repress. So we have a lot of our thoughts and feelings and ideas and emotions that are suppressed deep within us. And when we look at different characters in novels or in poems or in stories, we can analyze them based on this psychoanalytic criticism, where we look at the different psychoses that they might have. Jacques Lacan took some of the Freudian theories and then combined those with some structuralist theories that we're going to talk about in just a minute. And his point was that the thing that alienates people is their acquisition of language, and that language is the dividing point, and language is the problem. Okay, basically. All right, so I have some psychoanalytical terms here. I won't go through all these in detail, but we've heard them all before. We have the id, we have the ego, we have the superego, we have condensation and symbolism, we have displacement, we have the Oedipus complex, we have projection. So all of these psychological terms can also be used, because remember, literature is about human beings. Human beings are nuts, okay? Human beings are a bunch of psychos with dysfunctional behavior, codependency, bipolar tendencies, all these different things. And because when we analyze literature, we're analyzing the characters, then it seems fitting that we use some psychological terms in order to describe them. So there's your psychological criticism. Okay, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about structuralism just a little bit. This idea is based on the idea that literature is created by a bunch of symbols and signs. So semiotics is also a subdivision of structuralism. So we only know that the word TWO is a number because we spell it TWO. If we were speaking from another country where they spoke a different language, and we saw those three letters in a row that said TWO, we might not even know what that meant, because maybe in our language we spelled it differently, or if we used Arabic numerals, or we might have a totally different system of writing, just such as in Chinese or in Hebrew, where they have different styles of even writing it out. So the only way we know and understand what things mean is by the way that we write them out. There were some linguists, such as Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure, and he says that the relationship between an object and what we call it is arbitrary. So, for example, right there, well, I was going to use an example. He has an example of a chair is a chair because, why? Because, well, it's not a desk. A desk is a desk because it's not a chair. So but if we wanted to change those two words, after a while, we would start associating one word with the object and the other word with the object, and then we could, our mind understands that, and we would have a different meaning from that. So it's very complicated. I mean, there are books and books and books and books written about linguistics and about Saussure's ideas and structuralism and everything. But that's part of the main idea, is that an object is not the language that we assign to it. Okay? And a piece of language is not the object that we're representing from it. That's all arbitrary and can be changed at any moment. So a chair in English is chair, In Spanish, it's silla. The object is the same thing, but we might call it two totally different things. All right. And then structuralism makes us think of literature, literary works, as part of a larger system of language and of the fact that everything, we know one thing is something because it's not something else. That's the whole, the idea of la différence, if you've ever heard that word, la différence. It's a French word, but it means based on difference. And deconstructionists definitely use this term a lot. Okay, so deconstruction is the last one we're going to look at, and this developed out of structuralism. And deconstruction says that every text has within itself some way of unraveling it and of taking it apart and finding inconsistencies within a work so that you can say it doesn't really mean what it says it means. And this one is very controversial because basically it says that nothing means anything or everything means nothing. And you can take everything apart and just totally turn it over upside down. And people have had a lot of fun making fun of this theory of deconstruction because basically you're just taking everything apart and saying, well, nothing means anything anymore, and so there is no meaning. But it does have a purpose, and it's an interesting intellectual exercise to do that. So one of their points is not that everything means nothing, but that everything could mean something else. So that's kind of the idea here. And that's one of the things that I like about it is you can have multiple meanings to the same text, similar to but different than the reader response theory, in which you have this different people looking at something and thinking something different, having a different interpretation. This means that the deconstruction, the same theorist could look at something and assign different meanings to it. It could look at a poem. So you don't have to have different people looking at it in order to get that. Okay. So I think that's about it. So if you'd like some more information, I would highly recommend a couple of books here. One is called Beginning Theory by Peter Berry, and he does a really good job of explaining a lot of these different theories. And then also a book by Louis Markos called From Plato to Postmodernism, in which he takes you for a wonderful, thrilling, action-packed ride through the history of literary theory all the way from Plato to the 20th century. So I hope you learned something today. I am Dr. Lawrence J. Clark, and I'm going to sign off here. So I'd like to say thank you for listening. God bless, and have a great day.